Start? Yes. Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the first International Colloquium of Sociedade Brasileira de Retórica, a society founded in 2010 after its first conference in Ouro Preto, a colonial city in Minas Gerais, and of which I had the honor of being the first president. At that time, enthusiasm for classical rhetoric studies and its connection to other related areas grew utterly, and today, fortunately, interest in this area continues to increase, and it is with joy and honor that we welcome a professor whose work is already reference for studies on the emergence and characterization of this discipline, Professor Edward Schiappa. Welcome to Brazil, and thank you very much for your presence, even if it's only virtually. Professor Schiappa is an American scholar of communication and rhetoric, currently professor of the MIT, where he holds the John Burchard Chair of Humanities. He is the author of 8 books and numerous articles that have appeared in classics, communication, English, composition, philosophy, and psychology journals. He has extensive publication mainly on Gorgias, Protagoras, and now Isocrates. Schiappa has developed influential lines of research in 3 areas: classical rhetoric, contemporary rhetorical theory and argumentation, and popular culture. He will have as a respondent Professor Narbal de Marsillac, current the president of the Sociedade Brasileira de Retórica, and professor of philosophy and law at Universidade Federal da Paraíba in the northeast of Brazil. And Professor Narbal did part of his postdoctoral program at MIT when he met Professor Schiappa. Our other guest is Myrto Aloumpi, who is coming to Brazil for the second time, but now only virtually. Myrto completed her PhD in classical language and literature at Oxford in 2018 and has held posts since then as lecturer in classics at Somerville College, Oxford, and at Liverpool. This year, she is part of a research project at Liverpool Department of Communication and Media that used the concept of fallacy, stemming from Aristotle's first systematic analysis, to evaluate COVID-19 related to fake news. One of their goals is to develop educational tools that teach people how to identify the different fallacies in COVID-19 related news to help reduce the spread of misinformation related to the pandemic. Her respondent is Professor Priscilla Gontijo, a former undergraduate from the University Federal of Minas Gerais and PhD in history, ancient history in Coimbra University, with a thesis on Demosthenes. Priscilla is now a professor also at the Federal University of Paraíba. Each speaker will have about 25-30 minutes, and after the talks, the respondents will make their comments, and then we'll give the floor to the public by the chat. Before I give the floor to Schiappa, our first speaker, I would like to thank Priscilla and Narbal for organizing this colloquium with the graduate program in ancient philosophy at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, in particular with the discipline Rhetoric and Philosophy in Dialogue. I'm lecturing. And for inviting me to chair this session. I thank you all. And now, let us listen to our first speaker, Professor Edward Schiappa, who will talk about, I quote, the title, Dating the Origins of the Word Rhetorikê, the latest debate on whether it matters. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share a retrospective of a lot of my work, but also an engagement of some contemporary issues. This started back in 1990. I published an article called "Did Plato Coin Rhetorikê?" And I'm going to rehearse some of the arguments from that, but basically I was saying that Plato's Gorgias is the earliest surviving instance of the word in Greek literature, and that Plato is the likeliest suspect, we cannot prove it definitively, for having coined the word. In subsequent publications that I'll reference in a little while, I argue that the dating matters for how we interpret texts from that particular era. The latest chapter in the debate, I must give credit to Professor Luzzatto, who published an article last year called "Did Gorgias Coin Rhetorikê?" A rereading of Plato's Gorgias. And there's the citation for those who are interested. Professor Luzzatto disagrees with my thesis. She says, among other things, quote, Plato's Gorgias is our main evidence to the contrary, since an unbiased reading of the dialogue very clearly points to the sophist from Leontini as the teacher who first disciplined rhetoric and coined rhetorikê. Now, I'm going to obviously disagree with that. I'm not sure there is such a thing as an unbiased reading in the sense that we have to bring a certain amount of assumptions and inferences when we interpret a text from that era. But I'll try to identify what those biases are from my perspective when we get there. It is a very well-researched and thoughtful paper. It's a very impressive work. I will only be able to respond to it on a fairly sort of top level of abstraction today, but I do want to commend the high quality of work that went into that by Professor Luzzatto. So in my presentation today, what I want to do is first provide a brief review of my original argument. Secondly, in response to Professor Luzzatto, I want to argue that Plato's Gorgias is not a reliable source about the historical person and about linguistic usage of the time. And then thirdly, I want to argue that even if she is correct, the hermeneutic point of what I've called the origins of rhetorikê thesis remains intact, and that the word's popularization in the 4th century still suggests that the way we analyze certain texts from the late 5th and early 4th century should be altered by our later dating of the term. And I'll explain that in more detail in a little while. There are some sources that I will cite from myself here, and I just wanted to put this slide up briefly that has the main books that I will be quoting from today. Protagoras and Logos is the book in which I originally made the argument about the origins of the word after the journal article, of course, and apply it to a sustained study of Protagoras. The follow-up book to that was The Beginnings of Rhetorical Theory, which came out in 1999. It's in that book that I engage Gorgias to a significant extent and make some other arguments about the traditional narrative of the origins of Greek rhetorical theory. And then about a decade after that, my former student David Timmerman and I co-authored a book called Classical Greek Rhetorical Theory and the Disciplining of Discourse. There's a couple of chapters from that I want to reference later as well. So now to begin with, there are many sources, including Professor Luzzatto, who would agree that Plato's Gorgias is the earliest surviving text with the word rhetorikê. There's a little bit of a disagreement about how to date Alcidamus, but the vast majority of people that I'm aware of agree that Plato's Gorgias is the earliest. This is a footnote. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it gives you a list of sources that go back to 1936, indicating that people acknowledging that the earliest instance of the term that can be confidently dated is in fact in Plato's Gorgias. So I didn't know that, by the way, when I started work on my dissertation on Protagoras. I thought I was going to write a dissertation about Protagorean rhetorical theory. And it was only when I was really getting into the fragments in the text and started looking for the Greek word for rhetoric, rhetorikê, and not being able to find that I realized there was another narrative that needed to be told here. And one of the things that I found, as you can see here in this list of sources, that a lot of people acknowledge that Plato's Gorgias is the earliest instance. More importantly, or just as important, the word does not appear in late 5th century, early 4th century text where we would normally expect it to appear. That includes any of the text of the so-called older sophists. In none of those texts that are confidently dated to their lifetimes do we find the term. We do not find it in Greek drama. We do not find it in Greek comedy. I mentioned Aristophanes and Euripides because we know they were familiar with the sophist and sophistic doctrines. Aristophanes critiques the sophist by name and at times makes fun of their vocabulary in Clouds. And so again, we would expect to find it there. We don't find the word in the historians. We don't find it even in the first part of the 4th century by orators who we know, among other things, would try to undercut the credibility of their opponents, sometimes by referring to their shenanigans or their not being trustworthy. And surely if they had been trained in a particular art called rhetorikê, they would have mentioned that, I think. The other surprising place where one does not find the word are the text of Isocrates. And I will talk about that a little bit more later. But the point is, you cannot find the specific construction rhetorikê in any of those texts. It's particularly noteworthy to me that we do not find it in Gorgias's surviving text. We have more from him than we do from some sophists. And particularly in Gorgias's Helen, we find it's an innovative text. It was unusual at the time for him to use the word logismo to describe the speech's method, which is through reasoning. He theorizes about logos and how logos works. So you would think, again, if there was a particularly associated with him an acknowledged art of rhetoric, that he would have used the term. It's the earliest instance of a prose encomium. We say that because in the last sentence he identifies it as such. And it's also our earliest example of a stipulative definition where he says at one point, I define poetry as logos having meter. So we have somebody who's very linguistically self-aware here. Not only is he a noteworthy stylist, but he's particular about his vocabulary. He's analytic, he's rational, and he does not use the term that Professor Luzzatto at least wants to associate with him. There's also a text from after Gorgias's zenith, but before Plato's for the most part, known as the Dissologoi, sometimes called Dialexes. We don't know the exact author. It clearly has sophistic influence. And section 8 talks about the verbal arts, if you will, that are associated with the person who want to give advice to the city. Quote, the man acquainted with the skills, techne, involved in argument. Okay, logon techne will later become a term that is often used in a somewhat synonymous manner to rhetoric, including in the later dialogue by Plato, Phaedrus. He goes on to say, will know how to speak correctly, orthos legein, on every topic. To speak well, a person much knows the laws and the truth of things of which he would speak. So if there's a late 5th century sophistic text that we would expect to find the term, this is surely one of those. It's also noteworthy, by the way, that you see no Platonic division here between persuasive success and truth-seeking. In fact, in this passage, it's clear that good speakers, just like we'll find in later theorizing, must know the truth of things. And so it's not, rhetoric as divorced from the truth-seeking goals of, let's say, later called logic or something of that sort. We don't see that disciplinary split evident in that text. It's also the case that Plato, the reason that I think he's a likely suspect is he has the precedent, the motive, and the means. Plato coined over 250 words by adding the ike or ikos ending. And he was doing that in service of the philosophical argument he was making to link knowledge and skill. And he was particularly prolific with words describing the verbal arts. He introduced rhêtorikê, dialectikê, and antilogikê. So those are very similar terms to rhetorikê, and no one seems to dispute the fact that he originated these terms for the other verbal arts. And again, I think this makes him the likeliest suspect for rhetorikê as well. In terms of his motive, I'm not alone in reading the Gorgias as a sort of protrepticus, a call to philosophy, and one that contrasts his educational approach to that of his major competitor. And his major competitor in roughly 387, which is when we think the Gorgias was published, is not Gorgias, but Isocrates, who created the first sort of fixed location school. And both of them claimed this mantle of philosophia. And as Timmerman and I argue, Isocratean philosophia is understood as the cultivation of practical wisdom through the production of ethical civic discourse. And we unpack that in our book. But it is clearly a more politically engaged process. And it seems to me fairly easy and accurate, in a sense, for Plato to label this as the art of the rhetor, since political leaders were known by that term, rhetor. And so it makes sense that if he wants to distinguish what he's doing with another art or educational approach, rhetorikê was an extremely useful term for him to use. I might add a reference to an article by Arlene Saxonhouse, who argues that the unspoken theme of the Gorgias is war. I'll explain where the textual evidence is for that a little later. But her interpretation is consistent with those who have noted that there's a lot of different dramatic dates that are implicit in the text that are inconsistent, but they're all during the war with Sparta. And the argument that Saxonhouse made in 1983 is that this is the background in which people are reading this text at the time or hearing the text at the time. And that, it seems to me, would further fuel this distinction between the political art, which led to war, arguably, versus the philosophical Socratic life. The second main point that I want to make is that I think Plato's Gorgias is unreliable history. Luzzatto says Plato could not have used Gorgias or Protagoras or Hippias as fictional spokesmen of unlikely statements that they had never made without immediately bringing discredit on his own replies to him. That would make sense in the 20th or 21st century. But it does not really hold true when we talk about this particular period. And I think it's just contradicted by a lot of Greek literary conventions of the time, which often played very fast and loose with character portrayals and parody and things of that sort. Quick example, Aristophanes' portrayal of Socrates in Clouds. No one thinks that's accurate. And Plato in particular has been critiqued, or people have noted that he's not a good source for historical accuracy. Charles Kahn, in an important article that is about the dating of the Gorgias and the Protagoras dialogues, says it's misleading, how misleading it is the Socratic literature can be for anybody who approaches it in terms of in search of historical information. An important book by Ruby Blondell called The Play of Characters in Plato's Dialogue, and talks about how Plato and other writers of the so-called Socratic dialogues, because we know Plato was not the only one, were not bound by the canons of historical accuracy. She quotes Momigliano as saying, as a genre, the Socratic discourses occupied a zone between truth and fiction, between fact and imagination. And furthermore, in terms of Plato's Gorgias, the text is infamous for its anachronisms. Kahn argues that the dialogue is full of historical references that cannot be combined into a coherent date. This is echoed in Reginald Allen's translation of the Gorgias, where he says it's so riddled with anachronism that tense distinctions lose all meaning. Terence Irwin lists some of these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the point is that he makes references to things as if they just happened or are happening that span a period of nearly 30 years. And this is also recognized in Taylor and in, of course, E.R. Dodd's classic commentary on Plato's Gorgias. So the one thing they have in common is they span most of the Peloponnesian War, but there's no specific date that makes sense. So that is a brief summary of the reasons why I don't trust Gorgias, the Plato's Gorgias, as a guide to history. And there are, both reasons within the text, such as the anachronisms, but also outside of the text, the absence of the term being used, and in particular by Plato. What I want to do lastly is discuss why does it matter? And I have a lot of reasons, and I'm going to go through them somewhat quickly. The advantage of this being in video format is you can always go back and pause if you want to. But they're sort of deconstructive reasons and constructive reasons. And the deconstructive reasons are, as I portray in the 1999 book, Beginnings, I describe the standard account of the origins of rhetoric and identify 17 claims, all of which I think need to either be rejected or revised. And I'm going to list them all, but I'm not going to have time to talk about all 17. This is the first 6. The one that I will mention is, the traditional origin myth is that rhetoric originates with Corax of Sicily around 467 BCE. Now, I don't know what Corax did. In fact, Thomas Cole and I both have doubts about whether or not there really was a person called Corax, which meant crow in classical Greek. But whatever they did is they didn't publish anything in 467 that was called rhêtorikê. That is, so much in advance of the dialogue, the Gorgias, that it certainly would have popped up at some place. And I discuss all of these in some detail. As I said, for now, I'm just going to put them up there on the screen, hopefully long enough for you to read through if you're interested. But these are the standard account claims that I believe are either completely wrong or at least need to be revised in a significant manner. The second set are ones, again, dealing with the traditional or standard account of early handbooks, which, again, I will agree. I disagree with Thomas Cole on some things, but one of the things that Thomas Cole says in his book, The Origins of Rhetoric, is that these, what are later called technes, were probably collections of speeches. I think that's more plausible. The number 12 point there that I think is obviously pivotal is that it has been commonly believed for decades, and if not centuries, that the most important shared characteristic of the so-called older sophists was that they taught art of rhetoric. For obvious reasons, I have reason to doubt that, or certainly as they didn't use that term. I'm not saying that there wasn't speech making and argument giving that was being taught, but it wasn't codified as an art of rhetoric. I also want to reference an article by Michael Gagarin, 2001 issue of the journal Retórica, called "Did the Sophists Aim to Persuade?" A really provocative article, now 20 years old, that says that the role of persuasion, which is often what rhetoric is equated to, did not play the kind of role that we often think it did with respect to the sophists. Here's the last set of claims that, again, all of these are analyzed or disagreed with. I'm checking. I have a stopwatch going. I want to make sure I'm okay on my time here. Okay. So number 15, I want to call attention to the claim that the sophists were more concerned with political success than pursuing truth. I think there's good reason to doubt that with respect to the most of the sophists, particularly Protagoras, but also remember the passage from Disso Logoi that I quoted earlier. I also think that the belief that Plato's more philosophical rhetorical theory, which really doesn't get enunciated until the Phaedrus, which is a middle to later text by Plato, I think was formulated in response to 4th century competitors, including Isocrates and Alcidamas, and were really not about the 5th century sophists. There are 2 other quick deconstructive claims I'll mention. One is that we often believe that there were formalized parts of speech or standard divisions of speech. But we did a fairly in-depth analysis of those speeches and concluded that that's not the case, that in fact it can't be documented prior to the 4th century. And in fact, some of those terms can't even be found in the 5th century. It's also the case that George Kennedy's very fantastic, but in this particular case, I would disagree. His work, he categorizes in his historical account the categories of technical, sophistic, and philosophical rhetoric. And I think as powerful as those categories are, they don't work well in terms of describing what was going on in the late 5th century and early into the 4th century BCE. So most of these deconstructive claims, I think, have been accepted. Not all, but most of them have managed to survive in one form or another, with the obvious exception of today's topic of the coining and the dating of the coining of the term. Now, I'm again going to be, in the interest of time, move quickly through the constructive side, but I want to explain where it's coming from. This is a quote that got under my skin decades ago. It's when Professor Clausen said the linguistic studies of the Sophists were carried out not for philosophical reasons, not to examine the means by which a statement can be made, but for rhetorical purposes. We can even hear the sort of mere rhetorical purposes, to persuade people successfully, even at the expense of truth. And it was more or less accidental when some of those investigations produced philosophically important results. Not too many people would agree with that anymore, but I want you to know that when I was working on my dissertation in the late 80s, this is the kind of mentality that I saw myself as opposing, which was, I believe the result of a mistaken imposition of the rhetorical frame to understand and interpret everything the Sophists were doing. So again, time will not allow me to go through, but I've basically been spending my career revisiting these texts and these individual authors and speakers to see what do their texts look like if you take off the rhetoric versus philosophy binary as our primary lens. And so the book Protagoras and Logos does that with, obviously devoted to the subject of Protagoras. I only want to call attention to two of those highlighted points in this list here, though obviously you can investigate others, time permitting. One is that I read him as extending Heraclitus and responding to the Eleatics, and I again unpack that in the book. I think that is a very different way to read them, to think that he just became out of the blue an itinerant teacher of rhetoric. And in particular, the very last point on that list that I think kind of, for me, iced the cake was that the Greek verb for to be, einai, was extremely unusual to use that in an existential sense at the time. And Charles Kahn wrote extensively about this. And it was something that was done only by people who, with the benefit of hindsight, we identify as philosophers. And it was a key passage in several of Protagoras's fragments, and including the Concerning the Gods one. And so again, to me, that shows the problem of approaching his text with a purely rhetorical frame. Similarly with Gorgias, clearly Gorgias is very important to the rhetorical tradition, but I would argue that he should not be, our reading of him should not be limited to that. I think his focus on logos was deliberately expansive in the Helen, and it became an exemplar of later theoretical treatments. I want to mention specifically the reconstructed text known as On Not Being, because it, more than almost any other text, has suffered from the imposition of this rhetoric versus philosophy dichotomy. And if you remove that, you can actually see it's a very powerful text to both traditions. It is a response to Eleatic tracts about being by people like Parmenides, Melissus, and Zeno. And yes, it functioned as entertainment, but also as serious philosophy. A former graduate student of mine years ago and I worked on a formalization of the argument and found that it actually only makes sense, again, juxtaposed with Parmenides in particular. Also, to sort of wrap things up with Isocrates, again, he never used the term. but obviously is an important predecessor in terms of the rhetorical tradition. But the fact that he called that philosophy, I think, is something that if we want to respect him as an author, that we need to grapple with. An example of that I want to mention is the origins of the word dialectic, because that's a good example of how Plato was disciplining the vocabulary, because he was taking a term that was associated with the Sophists, dialegisthai, which meant holding discussion, and disciplining it into a rule-governed activity. Aristotle does the same in his work about dialectic, and that's I think where the action is happening in this transition from the Sophists to Plato. And some of that transition is enabled in Plato by the introduction of new vocabulary. So, in conclusion, and I do apologize for sort of rushing through a lot of those points, but hopefully you got them while I was going through them. I think that even if she's correct, even if Gorgias coined the term, but for some reason didn't use it in the Helen, there is still a lot to be learned about the text of that period of time if we assume that his use of the term was not widely influential until it was reported by Plato in his dialogue, the Gorgias. That we don't need the term to understand the texts that precede the dialogue, and frankly, they make more sense without imposing that term. I will leave you with one bonus that is associated with the pandemic. I just wanted to show you my pandemic hair that went away just a couple weeks ago before this talk. So thank you for your attention, and I will relinquish the floor at this point.
Very much, Professor Schiappa, for this. In a very short time, you put so many stimulating and important ideas for the history of rhetoric. Now, as I said, we are going to give the floor to Professor Myrto Aloumpi, and after her talk, then we'll have the answer, the respondent put in their questions and comments. Myrto will talk about the discourse of politics in the assembly and the courtrooms in 4th century Athens. Thank you very much, Myrto. I give you the word.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for the introduction and for the invitation, and many thanks to Priscilla and Narbal for organizing this. I'm very happy to be here, even if virtually this time. And I'm also very happy that what I'm going to present today is a part of what I will present today. I first presented in my first visit to Brazil. So this is how it evolved. So I'm very glad to have the opportunity to show it to you today. So what I will attempt today is actually a reconstruction of how Athenians talked in public when it came to politics. My approach is based on the idea that different public forums have different conventions, and so political debating has its own rules too. My reconstruction is based on evidence from the rhetorist's self-portrayal in deliberative contexts and for their assessment of political and other contributions. For this reason, it is important to start with a few words on some central concepts of this kind of rhetoric, above all, philotimia, love of honor, ambition, and reciprocity. Politics and ambition are often easily related, and perhaps this is expected. Perhaps it is also expected that ambition in political contexts or desire for distinction could have negative connotations. Thucydides on Pericles' successors and the way they conducted politics is a classic one. This is the second slide of the presentation. So we read that the successors were motivated by. Can we see? Can the audience see the second slide of the presentation? Yeah, thank you. So we read that they were motivated by idia kerdi, personal gain, and idia philotimiae, personal philotimia, which proved destructive for Athens. But also Aristophanes' comic treatment of the assembly may be a hint that the rhetores were aware of the damaging effect that philotimia could have in their political profile. In the Thesmophoria Zousai, and this is slide 3, the first thing Mika says when she addresses the assembly is the following. It is not out of philotimia by the two goddesses that I have risen to speak, ladies. So actually you still see the second slide. So if we can move to the third one. Yeah. So Mika says, it is not out of philotimia by the two goddesses that I have risen to speak, ladies, but because of Euripides and how he treats them. It goes on. So too quick to disavow philotimia, one may think. Indirect assessments and representations of politics and political debating seem to treat philotimia as a dangerous concept, as we see in Thucydides' passage and in Aristophanes' representation. But how about direct accounts? How did the rhetores themselves speak and present themselves? And what was the role of philotimia in the rhetoric of the assembly and of political discussions transferred in the courtroom? We need to turn to the 4th century for evidence. Of course, I am not concerned here with the empirical question of whether the rhetores actually arose to speak out of philotimia. This cannot be answered anyway. And of course, presence or absence of philotimia vocabulary does not mean presence or absence of philotimia as a motivational power from the assembly. But presence or absence of philotimia vocabulary may be telling for the kind of rhetoric and argumentation that was tolerated and promoted in the assembly. And this is what concerns me here in order to shed some light on some of the conventions of political debating. But first, a few words about philotimia and the rhetoric of it are necessary. Because philotimia remained an ambiguous concept in classical Athens, it could be positively or negatively colored depending on the context and the kind of activity it was associated with. To understand the rhetoric of philotimia in politics, we first need to see in what kind of context the rhetoric of philotimia emerged as a positive civic-oriented value. Especially from the 360s onwards, philotimia is positively evaluated in law court speeches and in honorific inscriptions. In the law courts, philotimia emerges as a positive motivational power when a speaker wants to claim that he has performed public services, especially monetary ones, for the benefit of the city, and therefore the implication usually is that he is a good democratic citizen or deserves the audience's goodwill, eunoia, or even a return of gratitude, charis, in the form of benevolent hearing in the courtroom. That's why in such contexts, philotimia and being philotimos is qualified as being expressed towards you, towards the city, towards the homeland, to convey this idea of reciprocity between the citizen and the city. You can see some isolated examples of the topos in slide 4 that is displayed right now. I'm not going to go through them, but there are also whole speeches, the rhetoric of which relies heavily on civic-oriented philotimia, such as Demosthenes against Leptines and Demosthenes against Medias. In honorific inscriptions of the mid-4th century onwards, philotimia perhaps becomes the #1 virtue in the name of which the city of Athens honors non-Athenian benefactors. The fact that philotimia is very often attested in what scholarship has called the ortatory clause of honorific inscriptions indicates that it belongs to the network of concepts that comprise the language of reciprocity. And you can see an example of that kind of rhetoric and honorific inscriptions in slide 5, where we read that Heraclides, in that case, a grain trader from Salamis, is honored so that others show philotimia, seeing that the city of Athens honors those who show philotimia towards her. So you see this reciprocal bond between the benefactor and the democratic city. In this context, then, philotimia is a prominent concept of the language of reciprocity, by which I mean language that seeks to create, reinforce, or disrupt bonds of mutual interest, primarily between excelling individuals and the democratic city. Apart from philotimia, central concepts of this language of reciprocity, as we find it especially in forensic speeches, both private and public, are the liturgies and other public duties and services, as well as the ensuing charis, gratitude. Now, partly because the surviving forensic speeches are more than the deliberative ones, quite often in scholarship, the rhetoric of the courtroom is taken as the paradigm of public rhetoric in democratic Athens. And this can be misleading. If it is said in the courtroom, this must be how Athenians spoke in other public spaces too. This is a conclusion easy to draw, but unfounded as far as surviving evidence allows. If we turn to assembly speaking and to discussions of politics in the courtroom, the picture is strikingly different, as we will see. Politics has its own etiquette, and this impacts the way the rhetorists present themselves, assess their political participation, and evaluate political decisions and achievements. In what follows, I will reconstruct some aspects of the language of politics as it is presented in Demosthenes, as it is reflected in Demosthenes' surviving deliberative speeches, and in Demosthenes 18, his speech on the crown, as it is part of a political trial that focuses particularly on political participation and assessment. I will examine three different themes: public service, the concept of charis, and philotimia. All three can belong to the language of reciprocity in forensic contexts, and examining them in the context of deliberative debating can give us an insight into the rhetoric of self-construction and self-presentation of the rhetorics. It needs to be emphasized that due to surviving evidence, my approach is demosthenocentric, and what emerges as the language of politics from my analysis may not be representative of the political class of democratic Athens as a whole. It may reflect, however, the way the regulars used to articulate themselves in the space of the assembly and in political trials. Let's start with the theme of public service, especially monetary contributions. There is a striking absence of recitations of public services from the assembly. A speaker would not normally refer to the achievements of his ancestors and to his liturgies to boost his persuasiveness, an important difference from the rhetoric of the courtroom. Indeed, the only exception is Thucydides' Alcibiades in the Sicilian debate, an unconventional rather than typical case of self-presentation in the assembly. If we leave that case aside, the only reference to monetary contributions in a deliberative speech is found in Demosthenes on the Chersonese, where Demosthenes' liturgies and other monetary donations are mentioned in passing. And this is the passage in slide 7. Another example, and you can see the reference highlighted in yellow. This is an important passage to which I will return later in the talk. Another example that is often employed in scholarship to argue for the rhetorical force of liturgies in the assembly is from Demosthenes against Medias, where Medias is attacked for referring to his liturgical status in the assembly. And this is the passage in slide 8. If we can move to slide 8. So Demosthenes says, if performing liturgies, men of Athens, consists simply of saying to you at all the meetings of the ecclesia and everywhere, we are the men who perform liturgies, we are the men who pay proisphora to you, we are the rich men. If saying that sort of thing is performing liturgies, I concede that Medias is the most distinguished man in Athens. He wears us out at every ecclesia and with his sickening and tactless talk. So while we cannot absolutely exclude the possibility that some rhetorists would exploit rhetorically their liturgies and public services, even in the assembly, it is difficult to disregard two things. Firstly, the only reference to monetary contributions in deliberative context is given in a very subtle way through the use of praeteritio. Demosthenes in the previous passage said, "I will not talk about my liturgies," and in this way, he mentions them very briefly. And secondly, in the passage from Against Medias, this passage, a forensic, not a deliberative speech, Demosthenes' purpose of mentioning Medias' alleged conduct may have been precisely to underline that Medias is actually breaching the etiquette of the assembly by mentioning his liturgies. And this would be consistent with the rhetoric of Against Medias as a whole, since there Medias is presented as a transgressive figure in every aspect. So far, the image of political debating we may reconstruct is one where the rhetorists probably do not exploit their rich liturgical services or other benefactions to the city to boost their persuasiveness and popularity. Neither do they attack rival speakers on the grounds of poor performance of public services. Of course, this does not mean, especially in the case of celebrity rhetorists, that once they rose to speak, the audience would automatically erase any knowledge they may have had of their public services or lack thereof. But it says a lot about the kind of rhetoric and self-construction that was tolerated and invited in the assembly. Now, let's turn to the concept of charis, gratitude, and this is slide 9. Appeals to charis in return for public service may have been an effective means of attempting to bond oneself with the dicasts, with the judges and the community by promoting unity of interests between the individual and the city. But it seems that this was not the case in the assembly. Again, we do not have evidence for rhetorists seeking to present their political advice as preferable due to an alleged stock of goodwill charis that they may have accumulated due to past services. Neither do we have evidence for requests to the people to reject the suggested policies of their rivals out of distrust due to the latter's lack of gratitude towards the city. Quite differently, when charis vocabulary is employed in our deliberative speeches, it has a very different meaning than that of positive reciprocity. Just as participating in politics for private considerations was to be avoided or at least concealed, speaking in order to gain or grant charis was something that the speaker would dissociate from himself and attribute to his rivals. Claiming that the rival politician has spoken to win favor, charis, was in fact a negative assessment of the quality of his political participation, pointing towards a form of calculation and fake short-term reciprocity. Let's see some examples of the rhetoric of charis in the assembly, drawing from Demosthenes' deliberative speeches and from his surviving proemia. In all cases, charis is consistently negatively colored, and in some cases, the relation of speaking for favor with deception and lack of reciprocity is articulated quite explicitly. So in the passage you see right now, according to the 5th premium, the practice of saying what one believes will bring him gratitude belongs to those who want to deceive, whereas enduring bad reactions from the people while giving one's most expedient advice is the sign of a loyal and just citizen. Also, speaking for charis in the assembly is sometimes employed to explain bad political influence that allegedly makes the city neglect her duties. So in slide, this is the passage in slide 11, at the beginning of the 3rd Philippic, Demosthenes argues that the main reason why the city fares badly in the war with Philip is the political influence of that kind of advisors who choose popularity with the audience instead of providing their best advice. Demosthenes, on the other side, claims for himself the courage of telling the truth and, anticipating the audience's displeasure, asks for a benevolent hearing on the basis of his honesty. The implication here is that those who speak to grant and obtain charis enjoy immediate popularity without actually benefiting the city, and even worse, to the long-term detriment of the city, whereas Demosthenes chooses to risk losing his popularity in order to give to the city the best he has. So in the image of political debating that emerges so far, rhetorists who speak with and for charis do not advise as needed. Instead, such kind of political advising borders with deception of the city, and not true mutual benefit stems out of it. Charis, as a motive in politics, expresses a way of fooling while pretending to gratify the collective. We may say then that when employing this rhetoric of charis, the rhetorists showed to appear as brave and helpful citizens that warned the people against pleasant but deceptive advising. Or if we are to avoid generalizing, we may say that at least Demosthenes did so. This negative employment of the concept of charis when evaluating political participation shows that what was part of the vocabulary of positive reciprocity in the courtroom was significantly redefined in context of the assembly and assembly-related activities. It seems that in the discourse of politics in the assembly, political or other contributions were not to be presented as investments in public gratitude. The discussion so far on the absence of both the theme of public service and of positive reciprocal charis from the assembly is essential for understanding and explaining why civic-oriented philotimia is also absent from the assembly. And here is the reason why. If the rhetoric of philotimia as a civic virtue was closely related to past services performed for the city, how could the rhetor present himself in the assembly as philotimos towards the city if public services and legitimate requests for gratitude were absent? One might think that monetary benefactions might be rightly absent from the assembly, but perhaps the rhetorists would seek to present themselves as civic-oriented philotimoi on the basis of their past political contributions. But neither this is attested in our sources, and so in the surviving deliberative speeches, we find all in all 7 references to philotimia. But 5 of them have negative connotations. 4 of them are about Philip, and 1 about one of Demosthenes' rivals, while the only one that is part of Demosthenes' self-portrayal is in fact a disavowal of philotimia as a motivational power of his political advising and public speaking. And I will return to that passage in a bit. Even though our evidence is limited, I think that we should take the cautious dissociation of political advising from acting out of philotimia and the general absence of the rhetoric of civic-oriented philotimia from the surviving deliberative speeches as deliberate choices that were reflective of the decorum of speaking, advising, and presenting oneself in the assembly. Let's see this through the example of Demosthenes' disavowal of philotimia that I just mentioned. And we should go back to slide 7. So this is the same passage that also contains the sole reference to monetary benefactions in the assembly that we saw earlier. So at some point on the Chersonese, Demosthenes assesses the quality of political participation as a kind of public contribution. And this evaluation takes the form of a comparison between Demosthenes and his political rivals. On the one hand, there are rhetorists who advise with Andrea in the sense of civic courage and bravery to give the best advice, even if it is unpopular. On the other hand, there are those who speak to obtain charis and popularity through policies that are easily digestible yet of ambiguous quality. Demosthenes, as expected, places himself among the brave speakers and continues his self-praise with an assessment of his public contributions. So Demosthenes leaves aside his monetary benefactions to the state and to individuals in order to focus on his political activity, his most important contribution to the community, as he says. It is the quality of this political participation that concerns us here. Demosthenes has been motivated neither by considerations of gain nor by philotimia. This is the text highlighted in green in this passage. But on the contrary, the kind of advice he has been offering to the city serves public interest to his own detriment in terms of popularity and positive reception from the people. In deliberative contexts, Demosthenes makes sure to present himself not simply as not Philotimos, but as anti-Philotimos. In other words, as the opposite to Pericles' successors in Thucydides, the passage with which I opened my talk today. Contrary to cases in forensic contexts and honorific inscriptions, where philotimia can be manifested as a civic-oriented virtue, considerations of philotimia in the assembly point towards an individualistic approach to political participation, and so Demosthenes makes sure to denounce it. Priority should be given to good advising and collective achievement rather than to personal excelling. And this is exactly what Demosthenes repeats a few moments afterwards. And this is the part highlighted in pink. Nor indeed does it seem to me the part of an honest citizen to devise political measures by which I shall at once take the highest place amongst you, but you the lowest among the others. No, the advancement of the state must always go along with the measures proposed by good citizens, and they must always support the best and not the easiest policy. These rhetorical choices show that even though policy making may in practice be a competitive process of contrasting interests and individual ambitions, there was an imperative need to promote collective superiority and political equality. In the public discourse of politics, being Philotimos failed to emerge as a positive rhetorical norm for individual politicians or for the political class collectively, if there was such a thing. This idealized picture of political participations seems to be in line with the aspects of the language of politics that we've discussed so far. It should be repeated, though, that this absence of the rhetoric of philotimia does not answer the empirical question of whether the rhetores who mounted the bema did so also out of philotimia. Just as we can never know whether litigants taking pride in their benefactions had really performed them out of philotimia towards the city, in the same way, the absence of the rhetoric of philotimia from the assembly does not mean that political participation was not motivated by ambition and love of honor. But in both cases, the presence and absence of the rhetoric of philotimia, respectively, can help us understand the scope of this concept and its impact in different discursive contexts. And what is also important, it can give us an insight into the constant negotiation of honor and power between individuals and the democratic city, which is reflected upon the different etiquettes that seem to govern the different public forums. That being said, what remains to be answered is who is eventually Philotimos in the assembly, or more precisely, who is allowed to be presented as such. I'll start with an example from the deliberative speeches. And we can go back to slide 12. So first of all, out of the 7 attestations of philotimia in deliberative speeches that I mentioned earlier, only one is a positive reference to the concept. And this one time philotimia is positive, it is not attributed to any individual, but refers to the collective. So in the speech on organization, Demosthenes points out that the trophies that stand in the city for the ancestors' great achievements are still a source of philotimia for the Athenians, in the sense that at their gaze, the Athenians of today take pride in the achievements of their ancestors. But gazing at them and taking pride in this way is not enough, Demosthenes continues. The purpose these trophies were erected for was to make next generations strive to emulate the virtues of the ancestors. And so we see that the only time philotimia vocabulary is employed in a positive way in deliberative contexts, it is an indirect call for collective philotimia in emulating the achievements of the ancestors and not in merely taking pride in them. Now, having examined aspects of the language of politics in deliberative speeches, it is worth examining how evidence from political trials corroborate this picture. I'll take the Crown trial quite briefly as an example, the trial between Aeschines and Demosthenes, focusing especially on Demosthenes' speech. This trial concerns the legality of a proposal for honoring Demosthenes with a golden crown for his services to the city that was blocked by Aeschines as unconstitutional. Eventually, the prosecution turned into an attempt to prove Demosthenes a bad political advisor and so unworthy of the crown. And this opened the ground for Demosthenes to turn his reply into a defense of his whole political career, a move that allowed him to include lots of self-praise in his speech. I think it is undeniable that Demosthenes' speech is a celebration of himself as a politician. But I also think that the close examination of the rhetoric of philotimia and eunoia, goodwill, in that speech may point to an attempt on Demosthenes' part to balance his self-praise with a more egalitarian approach to political participation, reflective of the etiquette of the assembly as we've seen it so far. Let's start with the most straightforward question then. Does Demosthenes, at any part of his speech, call himself a philotimos politician or present his political activity as motivated by civic-oriented philotimia? The answer is not only negative, but there is also a passage that shows how delicately philotimia is separated from political activity. We are at this point of the speech where Demosthenes compares his and Aeschines' lives in the form of a contest for the worthiest man. And this is slide 13, yes. So I read the translation. When I reached adulthood, I performed duties suitable to my background. I furnished choruses and triremes, paid taxes, lost no opportunity for private or public philotimia, but was of service to the city and to my friends. And when I decided to enter state affairs, I chose policies which earned me many crowns from both my country and the rest of the Greeks, and even you, my enemies, did not try to say that those policies were not honorable. Two kinds of philotimia are positively charged here. Demosia philotimia, the good done towards the city, Idia philotimia, private philotimia in the sense of benefiting one's friends, whereas political activity beneficial to the state is carefully dissociated from both. This indicates that not every field of action where ambition was expected to be found was at the same time suitable for a citizen to draw attention to his philotimia. Approved political choices have gained Demosthenes a lot of crowns, but never does he admit that he has acted out of philotimia in public affairs, or that his political achievements consist demonstrations of it. So if Demosthenes does not straightforwardly present his political activities as manifestations of civic-oriented philotimia, how does he present his political distinction? And eventually, who is philotimos in political discussions, if anyone? The answer to the latter is the city collectively, as long as philotimia is associated to the shared mentality of acting honorably that the Athenians have allegedly inherited from their ancestors. In fact, the only instance on the crown that philotimia is employed in an ethical evaluation of political attitudes, it is attributed to the collective, not to Demosthenes. And this is the passage in slide 14. Our country, Demosthenes says, always fought for the first prize in honor and glory and had expended more money and men in pursuit of honor and the common good than all the other Greeks had expended on their own behalf. This passage evokes the moral principles that the Athenian ancestors used to follow in external politics, among which philotimia figures prominently. Throughout the speech, there are several passages that reflect this shared mentality that we may call mentality of collective philotimia. Central to this idealized mentality is the idea of acting in a manner that does not prioritize their own profits to the detriment of others, but is widely beneficial and distinguishes the city in honor and glory, even though it may cost heavily. Demosthenes may tactfully avoid calling himself a philotimos symbolos, but the way he presents himself conducting politics reflects at the level of the individual this mentality. To give you just one example, when he compares himself to Aeschines as advisors of the city, this is passage 1 in slide 15, Demosthenes claims that he devoted himself to policies expedient to everyone without avoiding or calculating any kind of personal risk and danger. His anti-Macedonian policy, as we read in the same slide, next passage, reflected the spirit, phronima, of the ancestors exhorting the city to become once more the leader of an honorable cause. Just as previously in Marathon, Plataea, etc., the Athenians took upon themselves the peril of war for the freedom and salvation of all. So in this context, Demosthenes casts himself as a symbolos who offers advice on asserting the city's preeminence, and so through his noble political suggestions, he emerges as a bearer of collective philotimia, promoting the advancement of the city's honor and distinction. So he becomes ton periton proteion symbolon. Now, if we are to identify one abstract quality which Demosthenes often chooses to present as the motivational power behind his political activities, that is eunoia. And even politics are presented as a contest of eunoia in which Demosthenes thrived. And this is the last slide, slide 16. So we read, so I say, look at me in comparison with today's speakers, with yourself, with anyone you like. I shun no contest. At times when choice was to be made of the best policies for the city, and patriotism was an issue of emulation in which all could compete, patriotism is eunoia, I was seen to be the best speaker of all, and all our affairs were conducted through my measures, laws, and diplomacy. None of you was anywhere to be seen, except when you had some mischief to do to the people. Why eunoia and not philotimia? I will start my conclusions from here. Because the language of eunoia and goodwill allows Demosthenes to present his political excellence in a much more humbling manner, as the aspect of political participation that is emphasized through eunoia is patriotic loyalty in serving the public interest, something expected by every citizen, not the potentially dangerous element of pursuing individual distinction that is always prominent in philotimia. The rhetoric of civic-oriented philotimia was indeed wide and covered many domains of activity, elite and non-elite, at polis and dim levels. But the examination of the language of politics that I attempted today shows that it was not as widespread as to include the rhetorical exploitation of every area of public behavior as a competition of honorable philotimia. The very same Demosthenes who emerges as an exemplary elite philotimos citizen in Against Medias and praises the value of cooperative philotimia throughout Against Leptinis, when addressing his fellow citizens in the assembly, refutes or silences the fact that he has been motivated by philotimia to take an active political role. In the same vein, in his political trials with Aeschines, we saw that Demosthenes does not capitalize on his political contributions as tokens of philotimia. The rhetoric of the assembly was considerably different from the rhetoric of the courtroom, and the rhetoric of political contributions was different from the rhetoric of financial contributions or other public services. How are we to explain this discrepancy? Personal distinction, public recognition, and honors were enjoyed by successful rhetorists. But in a democracy, political achievement, the outcome of cooperative effort between individuals and the collective, ultimately belonged to the collective. And in terms of public decorum, politicians could not afford to challenge this publicly. So the rhetoric that dominates is that of individual political contribution as duty that needs to be performed in the best possible way. And what is stressed is the common obligation to contribute one's best, not the personal ambition to get honored for doing good. This also shows that at the level of ideology, politics and the assembly belong to a different discourse of honor negotiations in which the ultimate philotimos was the city itself, and the duty of political advisors was to promote with their decisions and their proposals the collective's philotimia and interests. In this vein, I view the absence of the rhetoric of individual philotimia and of public services from the assembly as a way of depersonalizing politics and political debating that catered to the needs of the city by promoting deliberation in terms of public interest and by presenting decision-making more as a collective achievement and less as a field of personal distinction. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Myrto, for this very interesting presentation. And I think you had two different kinds of approach. Professor Schiappa showed the problems, theoretical problems, also the debate about theory of rhetoric, and you present a stud case of speech, and I think you have very interesting also questions and approach to these two different presentations. And then I'm going to give the floor now to our two respondents. Please, Narbal, and please, Priscilla, and thank you very much again.
Should I start? Okay. First of all, I'd like to say how much I'm happy to meet again Professor Schiappa. It's pretty nice to be here. And I actually am going to ask you two questions only, Professor. But I think you already answered, just for our audience to be more clear. Based on our previous conversation, I learned it with you, Professor. Being critical is be willing to consider all the options we have. So I read Did Gorgias Coin Rhetorikê, a rereading of Plato's Gorgias from Maria Tania Luzzatto. I read it. It's pretty good paper, and it's too long, but it's pretty good. Despite the Luzzatto's recognition of the increasing consensus of the assumption that rhetorikê was invented by Plato and Gorgias, your thesis, she insisted, I quote her, "The absence of rhetorikê in 15th century texts is no longer an anomaly, and the missing word is readily found where it might be expected to appear," end of quote. It means in Gorgias' text, my point is, I think that this is extremely unlikely. The Plato coined eristikê, dialectikê, antilogikê, but not rhetorikê, which is why I ask you, Professor, due to the lack of sources and inspired by the John Child's work, could we say that the history of rhetoric is rather the rhetoric of history of rhetoric? Because on your own words, I quote you, not because of you, of course, but because of our audience. Unless we find new texts from this time period, there simply is no way to resolve the question with certainty. I mean, we are dealing here with rhetoric of history. There is no chance to find the answer on certainty. And another question, Professor, it's a topic that you didn't talk about, but I love it because I work with contemporary philosophy, is about your words also. Isocrates can be read as a forerunner to contemporary pragmatism. I love this thesis. It means that ortholegein, this is my question, is or could be take the correct measures to produce a specific outcome. I know you're talking about, I just want to hear you a little bit more. Thank you very much, Professor.
Sure. I might need you to amplify a little bit more on the second one, but I can address the first one. I absolutely agree that we are in territory, if you will, that is incapable of certainty and maybe even of high probability. From my standpoint, it doesn't matter, because for me, the intervention, people always, for totally understandable reasons, we're very interested about origins. And we want to know, well, if somebody invented a term, who was it and why did they do it? And we can't answer that. We can speculate, which of course I've done, but we can't answer that. But for me, the more important realization that goes back 30 some years ago now is revisiting these texts, taking off the rhetoric versus philosophy binary distinction that has been used to interpret them for so long. So what happens if we do our best to return to the ipsissima verba of the time, when we have it available, and we're not really using more contemporary labels to make sense of it? I think the related theme that I try to talk about in several of my publications is I'm interested in what certain texts do more than I'm interested in what they say. So, for example, again, Gorgias's Helen is an example of that. It does some very interesting things in terms of prose composition that we didn't really see before. And I think that it in a sense, it doesn't matter if we want to canonize that as rhetoric or philosophy or just the history of discourse, pick a kind of more neutral term. It's still nonetheless noteworthy and interesting that he's the first person to define a term explicitly. He stipulates a definition before we have evidence that Socrates or Plato did that, right? And that he uses as I mentioned in the talk, a systematic approach to reasoning. So for me, the layer that I did not talk about today is also the transition from predominantly oral culture to an increasingly literate culture, and how that also changes patterns of composition. And one of the things that I found by saying Protagoras' fragments out loud is that they were crafted to be memorized. They were aphorisms to be easily remembered. And again, the rhetoric philosophy dichotomy doesn't help me see that, but understanding a person who is wrestling with expressing ideas in a way that hadn't been done before is what I found very interesting. And the hat tip I need to give there is to Eric Havelock. Eric Havelock was, his work on not only orality and literacy, but also going back to the pre-Socratics and trying to wade through Plato and Aristotle's retelling to get back. Again, part of his emphasis is what were they doing? They were trying to create new secular ways of making sense of the world. And again, I think that is a happy result of trying to set aside some of these issues. So I'm not 100% sure what your second point was in terms of Isocrates and pragmatism. I, on one hand, have told my students, don't do that. Don't try to find these people as anticipating contemporary theories, because then when you do, you've got Gorgias, the postmodernist, and Protagoras, the first in humanist, this, that, and the other. But in terms of recovering Isocrates, he has been, until recently, and there's a lot of work in the last couple of decades that have rescued him from that sort of he was only a teacher of rhetoric, to understanding him in larger terms. And so part of my way of rehabilitating his use of the word philosophia was to kind of point out, what, that kind of actually resonates with certain uses of the term today being used by certain neo-pragmatists and pragmatists. So that was what was behind that.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I start now, or we read the question to Schiappa?
No, Priscilla, please, could you talk now, and then after you, and
yeah.
I'm going to the question.
Okay, because I think it's 2 or 3 questions to Professor Schiappa. So I will be brief. Thank you, Schiappa and Myrto, for the conference. And anticipate my apologize if I did do some mistake in English. I'm nervous. I don't like to speak English, but I will try. So I will comment. I focus my comment on Myrto's a presentation on 3 points. First, I agree with Myrto when she says that political debate in the assembly has its only rules. So I believe that the assembly and the court are space for complementary political action. So we have to think this way, like one complete the other. But which one has his own rules and has the possibility of construct a different kind of ethos, like you say, self-portrait, but I prefer use the term ethos. Thinking it this way could be help to understand the use of philotimia to me. Because at the assembly, the orator would not have the opportunity to point something beyond the proposed debate. Size could suffer an immediate interruption of the audience through boo, claps, or other interactions. And to my point, the construction of acts must take place before the assembly. The audience must already know that the orator is a good citizen. And the orator only uses a few words to remind the audience about this ethos. It's not construct ethos in the assembly. Therefore, we must think about the construct of the ethos before the assembly space. And to me, the court, it's important to do this. In the court, there is a large possibility of self-construction, of construction of ethos, showing other citizens, the orator as a citizen concerned about city and performing out the liturgies. And perhaps this explains how the topos of liturgy it's common, it's influenced rhetoric, not in assembly. So we know the studies show in the court there is more possibility to use philotimia and charis. And so my first question is just I would ask you to comment about this, and to me have to explain the two spaces together. It's difficult isolate only the assembly. I know the study must be limited, but I think the two space, thinking about two space will be helpful. The second, continue from the perspective of making the ethos before the assembly. It's also important to consider the role of political groups and the circulation of political pamphlets or propaganda. And so it's important to take the speech as a political pamphlet. And I say that because you use two speech, Demosthenes 28 and Demosthenes 21. We know it's a political propaganda, medias and about the crow. There are revised speech and circulate after the deliberation. In the case of Demosthenes 21, there is still a chance that speech have not even delivered. So And this true speech, in particular, presented the Demosthenes ethos most strongly. So, and it's the true speech. You have more example. So, and the Demosthenes ethos is made from oppositor to another. First case Aeschines, and the other case Medias. So I ask you, would it be possible to think the use of the philotimia argument, or use the philotimia in two different contexts? First context, in this comparison with the adversary, the opponent, like the most 28 and 21. In the other group, I don't know like how to call this group, but I think it's like the context of debate of ideas, like, but it's a group with speech like Philippics and the Olympics, because it's so different speech. You think it's the size is different, the proposition is different. So maybe you can separate this speech to help in your analysis. So first, understanding that discourse, that speech shares concepts, and that democracy it's a shared ideology, like proposed Ober. It's clear the democracy presenting Demosthenes' speech, it's based in practice and values from before the Peloponnese War. So it's choose the orator should Athens should be the leader of Greece, and the Athenian elite has an important role in this leader, to make Athens leaders a leader. So I say that to think about, you say, anti-philotimia. So anti-philotimia could be Demosthenes' strategy to attack the opponent's proposal. And if you think that reinforce the idea that Demosthenes' ideas not be so popular, and Demosthenes could have to use all your skill, how to ability to persuade his fellow citizen. So anyway, your paper show again the ability of Demosthenes to adapt the speech to different situation and different audience. And Demosthenes, every word is important. So I think that. And my question, what philotimia in the speech of assembly, just in the context of assembly, could indicate about the democratic practice for the 14th century? So I think it's maybe this ausence could be explained some new practice to democracy, and think about it. Peloponnese War. It's turning point. Not a turning point, but it's a mark. It's from the Athenian democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priscilla, for all the valuable points, actually, and very good questions. So I will try to address them all. I'll start from the first one. about the ethos of the rhetor as being constructed before the assembly, and the distinction between the courtroom and the assembly. Well, my paper is actually based on this distinction, so there we agree. The rhetoric of philotimia, of public services, of charis is very prominent in the courtroom, precisely because it is an arena where you focus on yourself, because you want to win the trial for yourself or for the person you're talking in behalf, if you are a synegoros. But the spotlight is on you. So character construction is really, really important. When we move to the assembly, the city and the best policy is at stake. And the politicians, not the politicians, I'd rather avoid that term, the rhetorists need to emphasize that and need to be to give the best they have. It's not a place where, for periautologia, is a place where you discuss public interest. But at the same time, I'm not sure that we can take as a rule that the construction of the ethos should come before the assembly. And I'm saying that because lately in scholarship, a lot of people have shown that political debating is probably, contrary to what we used to believe, is not does not belong to a very closed group of speakers. So yes, we might have speeches from a very limited group that survive, or we may know the names of a very small group of people addressing the assembly, but new readings of inscriptions that attest, that give evidence for political decisions, reveal a great amount of names of people proposing things or proposing amendments to more important political decisions that are completely unknown, which shows that there was a much greater circle of people that would actually address the assembly, even if it was briefly, that probably were complete unknowns. So in these cases, they wouldn't have much time to go for a character construction, neither at the point of the assembly nor before that. So I think it's important to remember how biased our evidence is. And that's and this thing, I think, also answers partly your last question, the question about whether the use of philotimia in the assembly says something about democracy in the 4th century as being somehow different from the 5th century, where we have all these big names that are prominent, or we have Alcibiades presenting himself in such a illustrious way. I think that the fact that philotimia and the language of reciprocity that was so important for constructing very often an elite status was not allowed in the assembly, precisely because political debating, was an open process. So if these things are excluded in the sense that if you talk in this way, you're going to wear the audience out, if these things are excluded, they're probably excluded so that everyone can start from the same line. Everyone has the political equality that boils down to paresia and isegoria, the right to speak open to everyone. So if these things that are marks of elite status are in one way or another missing from political debating, I think is also reflective of the fact that political debating was a much more open procedure. In this way, everyone could present themselves as people who want to give the best advice to the city, but not everyone could say that I am a philotimos citizen in this or that way, in the way we find it in the courtrooms. Now, sometimes I'm thinking whether in the 5th century the regulars had much more scope for self-presentation. And the thing is, we don't have a deliberative speech from the 5th century. We have Thucydides reconstructions, which can be indicative of actual debating, but they can also be misleading. So I used to think that perhaps Alcibiades Thucydides is actually reflective of 5th century politics. But as I work on this topic more and more, I tend to believe that he is an exception even for the 5th century. I cannot be sure about that, but that's how I see it. So in this sense, I would go more for a kind of continuity between the 5th and the 4th century in terms of political debating, rather than a radical change where political debating in the 4th century becomes a more egalitarian thing compared to the 5th, because I believe that political debating is a matter of the collective par excellence. And the second question was about why about the fact that some of the speeches are revised, such as Demosthenes 18 and the fact that Demosthenes 21 might not have been delivered. Well, I think it doesn't affect my argument whether Demosthenes 21 was actually delivered or not. And I agree that there is probably a lot of revising in Demosthenes 18. But even if this is the case, the values that are reflected in these speeches are found consistently across forensic oratory. You're right that self-construction is much more prominent in these speeches, perhaps because we have those very well-known figures. The rivals, Aeschines and Midias, were prominent citizens, and perhaps this gives even much more space for Demosthenes to go for a comparative character construction. But at the same time, all these topics, the liturgies, the charis, the philotimia, all these topoi are found in very many speeches of forensic oratory. So in that sense, I think that these speeches are examples of this rhetoric rather than exceptions. And the point about viewing the rhetoric of philotimia as different in the Olympics and the Philippics, I think that's the case. That's the case, actually. The rhetoric of philotimia is much different in deliberative speeches in general compared to the courtroom examples that I gave. So I agree with you on that, and this was one of the points I wanted to stretch in my talk. And lastly, the point about anti-philotimia as a way of attack. I'm not sure I understood this point fully on anti-philotimia as a way of attacking the advisors' proposals. So you, if I remember well, you said that perhaps this is a rhetorical device by Demosthenes precisely because he has used all his weapons. He's not popular. He needs to find a way of convincing the audience. It could be, and we only have Demosthenes deliberative speeches, so I cannot compare to other deliberative speeches and argue otherwise. So if this is a unique rhetorical strategy by Demosthenes or not is difficult to answer, but it could be what you're saying. At the same time, we only have 7 references to philotimia in Demosthenes, and 5 of them are negative, but 4 of them are about Philip. So Philip is the excessively ambitious monarch. So this assessment of philotimia, if you think about it, is outside democratic context. It is a monarch that is negatively assessed as philotimos. This is also important to remember. Outside democracy, philotimia perhaps is more easily identified with the negative side of it. I don't know if I forgot something, or if you want to. You are on mute, and we cannot.
You answer everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Priscilla, Myrto. We have a lot of questions. We have a lot of compliments. Congratulations for the talks, and also for Professor Schiappa's hair. A lot of comments about it. I don't think, perhaps you're not able to answer, all the questions that are put. I believe that we could give now pass the floor to Professor Schiappa. Yes. See?
Just a question. We have here in Brazil, Professor Schiappa, a ton of the professors that call you Schiappa, and a ton of the professors that call you Schiappa. For example, I call you Schiappa. What do you prefer?
I prefer Ed.
Okay.
Schiappa is the more Italian. I just don't happen to have any actual Italian blood in me, but Schiappa is fine. You know, I'm serious when I say, you know, one of my standard first day of class jokes is I tell the students the different ways to pronounce my last name, and then I just tell them to call me Ed. But
please.
I have been taking some notes on the questions, and I think I could buzz through a few of them that are aimed at me. Is that okay?
Please.
Okay. So I guess, I don't know if these are all, I guess they're not. Oh, yeah. So if people have the YouTube feed up, they can see these questions on there if you want to see the actual wording. But I'm just going to sum them up and answer the ones that were directed to me fairly quickly. So the first one was, first set was from Rafael Silva, and it was sort of about, well, what did the sophists have in common? Is there a branding there? He didn't use the word branding, I do. That in terms of the linguistic arts that they were focusing on. And my answer to that is no. I think actually that's the mistake that we've made, is to try to come up with a sophistic blank. I actually wrote an article that is a chapter in the beginnings book that tries to deconstruct the whole notion of there being a sophistic rhetoric, because they are so different, and it's so hard to even define what sophist means. I do think the closest thing to a commonality is, again, goes maybe back to what I said earlier about the transition from orality to literacy. They were all trying to put prose to new uses, and doing that in various ways, and exploring language. You know, I mean, Prodicus's interest in what we would now call synonyms would seem to be a segue to Socrates' attempt to define what is X. So I think they were all, you know, the intellectuals of their period, and, you know, language and the relationship perhaps between language and what we would call now reality was one of the things that they were exploring. I'm just going to keep going here for a little bit, and cut me off when you need me to. So Andre asked about the true rhetoric. I don't think I know that this is a little bit contentious and we don't have time to totally parse it out. But I don't think there's a true rhetoric revealed in the Gorgias. I think we get that in the Phaedrus, which I think is actually Plato running up the surrender flag. I think he would have liked to have seen rhetoric quashed after the Gorgias. But obviously in the 4th century, there were people teaching what we would now call rhetoric. And I think Plato sort of says, well, if you really are interested in that, you can still come to my school. And in fact, I'm going to lay out some of the principles of what a legitimate rhetoric or a true rhetoric looks like. And he even does that through sample speeches, the first 2 of which he critiques. It's actually an exercise in rhetorical analysis and speech writing. Plato also wrote speeches in many other dialogues showing his ability to do that, such as the Symposium and the Menexenus. So yeah, my reading of the Phaedrus is a little bit idiosyncratic, but I think that is where he is surrendering to the competition in the sense of trying to set up his own shop. By the way, I asked and it was received. You now see that my email address is there where my name would be. And that's there to invite anybody who we don't have time to answer today. If they want to contact and follow up with me individually, I'd be happy to do that. So maybe one more here. Luca, I believe, was asking sort of, well, what is the status of techne, of this techne that we now recognize in the early 4th century BCE, and about rhetoric, and sometimes because of the linguistic construction of that, the word rhetoric in contemporary usage, and even sometimes a little bit in Plato, slips between 3 very different things. There's rhetorical theory, theorizing about persuasion, about language, about what it means to be a rhetor, what the so-called nature of speech is, and things of that sort. So we see Gorgias theorizing about logos in the Helen, which is an example of this sort of theorizing that we could now recognize as contributing to the canon of rhetorical theory. That's one sense of rhetoric. A second sense of rhetoric is pedagogy, right? The teaching of speech making. Clearly that's happening. What it was called, we're not sure. Maybe logon techne. And so that's a second sense of rhetoric, though. We have subscript 2, if you will, that is distinct and may or may not have anything to do with the first sense of rhetoric. We don't know how Gorgias taught rhetoric. We really don't. We think it might have been through imitation, but that's probably true of most of the people at the time. But that's rhetoric as pedagogy. And that is yet again distinct from what Professor Aloumpi was talking about, which is rhetoric as practice. What are they actually saying in their speeches? What are the structural features and what are the themes that we can analyze from actual practicing rhetors? So when I hear the word rhetoric, the first thing I try to decipher, particularly when scholars are talking about this era, is which sense of rhetoric do they mean? Theory, pedagogy, or practice? Because its status varies considerably depending on which aspect that you want to emphasize. And it's remarkable how little we know at any depth about how it was taught. And what we know about the practice, of course, is what's preserved, and we know that's only, of course, a fragment of that. So why don't I pause there and see what the will of the room is here.
Thank you very much. As all the people who are listening to, feel free then to contact Ed. And before I give the word also to Aloumpi to answer the other question, if you allow me, I would like Professor Ed to make a point that I think is very important related to Gorgias, to the treatise on not being. Because we always use this treatise, taking it from Dies Crans, not in the context. If you go to Sextus Empiricus, it's very interesting to see that the treatise is not in the book against rhetoricians. There is nothing about Gorgias there. Sestus start talking about Plato's Gorgias, talk about Helen beauty as a way of persuasion, but he didn't mention Gorgias. When you go to against logicians, and the problem is a proof theory about true, and then Gorgias is there in the problem of criterion. It's a completely different approach. And I think this should be at least considered, not to do another sort of history of the philosophy or rhetoric, only based in Sestus Empiricus, but at least to consider this. There are other approach. And I think also a point that you made that, well, I like very much your work. It was so important for me when I was doing my PhD and my master. And one thing that you mentioned about poetic and epic compositional habits in the work of Gorgias, I think that when you go to Plato's Gorgias, and in the end of the book, Plato's compare demagogia with poeticé, and then with rhetorikê, and then theater without rhythm, without music is rhetoric. I think it's a way to attack a sort of language in which prose and poetic is very connected. And this approach to the language, it was completely criticized by Aristotle. And then this idea of to have a prose with poetic approach was not considered in the history of philosophy. We have always the idea that philosophy is clarity, and then we cannot use these two mixed visions, let me say, sorry about my English, of language. But I think this is a very important point, and in the Gorgias also, it was the only thing I want to comment.
I appreciate that, and I very much like what you were saying. There are two things I want to pull out of your statements. One is the importance of the reception of what the Sophists were doing by the very people who are reporting it. So, Aristotle is interpreting people like Gorgias and Protagoras, even as he's retelling them. And we have to kind of look at what is his agenda when he's talking about that. And that sometimes leads to what we would recognize as distortion, because we have access to other sources and sometimes we don't. And that's why I like your example of the Sextus Empiricus reception of Gorgias clearly treats him very differently, and the argument on not being very differently than for example, Isocrates does. Who only kind of makes a brief joking reference to it. So the reception, I think, is really, really key. And the word that I like, and this also responds to a question that I did not get to earlier from, let me just see who it was here. It was the very last, C-A-U-L-M, calm. The word I like is argument and argumentation. I think that captures the notion of logos that combines what we would now call rhetoric and logic together into, making a case that, involves what we would recognize as reasoning without abstracting it, and involves what we would call evidence without doing what the positivists would do 2,000 years later. So I like to think of that's what the Sophists were about, was teaching argument. We don't have any evidence about them teaching delivery, for example, which later becomes one of the canons. So I think that again shows a conceptual way to bridge the traditional philosophy rhetoric divide.
Thank you very much. Myrto, I think there is a question by Mateus to you. I think probably this will be the last, about the relation between Athenian political discourse and mathematics in the 4th century. And there is also a last one, I think. By the way, the name is Kawin, Professor. There is another question from Pedro Parini also to Schiappa. It was put in the last moment. If Ed wants to think about it also, and then you go until 6 p.m. and you close. But then, Myrto, you have the word now.
Thank you, Mateus, for the question. It's an interesting coincidence that it's about methics, which is my new research project that I'm developing right now, is about the relation between citizens and foreigners and networks of reciprocity and civic obligation. I have some perhaps preliminary remarks on that, as this is a topic I will now start exploring more in depth. Well, I think that in the public discourse, in political discourse, methics are quite prominent through honorific inscriptions, because a lot of them are honored for services to the city, and sometimes they're honored by being given some privileges or obligations that are usually performed by citizens. And this is an interesting point to think. What does it say for the kind of bonds of reciprocity that the city wants to build with its own citizens and with the foreigners that reside in the city, and how this may be translated in terms of social status when it comes to two groups that are formally and legally strictly separated, the methics and the citizens, but at the same time, in terms of everyday life, there is, I think, a great degree of assimilation. Now, when it comes to rhetoric, we have some, to oratory, we have some, we have quite a few references to methics. We have, I think, about 4 speeches of Lysias mentioning methics, and also Lysias himself was a metic. So I think we have references, especially in speeches that discuss the 2 oligarchic coups. There we learn a bit about the activities of methics in terms of political discourse. And then I cannot think of, something really, really, I cannot think of methics as related to some kind of distinctive political argument right now, but maybe that's because I don't know the material in that respect so much in depth. I haven't focused yet on methics, but I do plan to work on that on this project, and I hope I'll have more to say when that's done. But thank you very much for the question.
Well, thank you again. Sorry, can you listen? It's almost 6 p.m. and in Crete it's probably very late also, but I thank you very much. There is still some question, as I think you can also contact Professor Ed, as he said, by email. Sorry about not being able to be more here, but I would suggest that it's such an stimulating meeting that we would appreciate very much in the future if we could meet again, perhaps in presencia here in Brazil in a better time. And I would also suggest to some people who ask about logos, one of the last books that has an afterwards by Edward Schiappa is Logos Without Rhetoric, that you have here. I think this is a very interesting subject to discuss, and I'm very happy that we have such an interesting meeting and with a lot of students, colleagues from many parts of Brazil. And I do hope you continue this discussion in the future. I thank you very much, Myrto, Aloumpi. I thank you very much, Edward Schiappa, and all the people who are here, and also Priscilla and Narbal, my dear colleagues from Brazil, and also Marco and Marcos Daniel and Daniel, who are helping with the technical questions. All of you, my heartfelt thanks, and let's talk about rhetoric more and as much as you can. I give the word to you now to give your last words to the public and to the people. Thank you. Priscilla?
Thank you very much for inviting me and for the very enjoyable last couple of hours here.
Thank you, Myrto and Ed, for nice afternoon, and to use the opportunity to say the next semester we will do the second colloquium. So please follow us in Facebook. You can. Everybody can see more information about the colloquium and the next Jornadas Duplas de Retórica. So thank you.
And thank you very much for inviting me as well. It was a pleasure to be here with you, even if virtually this time. And yes, I wanted to also say that if people want to ask me any questions, of course, you can email me. And if you could circulate my email with the audience, that would be great. I would be happy to continue this really, really stimulating conversation we had today.
Thank you. Before I give the last word to the president of the Sociedade Brasileira de Retórica, just a thing. Tomorrow we will have at 4 a round table with Maicon Engler, who is just translated a new translation in Portuguese of In Common of Helen and Palamède's Defense. He will talk about Gorgias, and with Tiziano Curvelo, professor of Greek at University of Rio de Janeiro, who will talk about his translation and comment of Contra os Sophistas and In Common of Helen by Isocrates. Then this round table, you can also bring back some question about Gorgias, Logos, and rhetoric. Now, Narbal, our president, the last word.
Thank you. I just want to say how much I'm grateful to you, Professor Aloumpi, Professor Schiappa, Ed, as you said. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank also Cecília, Priscilla, and every student. I asked my students to make the tough questions, and they did. Thank you very much. It was awesome. Thank you very much for all. Thank you.
Bye.